you don't realize it at first. That's what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't come in loud arguments or obvious lies. It creeps in slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. One day, you're confident in how you feel, clear about what happened, grounded in your reality, and then piece by piece, something starts to shift. You begin second guessing yourself. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you misunderstood something that felt so real in the moment. You ask yourself questions you never used to ask. Did that really happen like I remember? Am I being too sensitive? Why do I feel like I'm always the problem now? And here's the part that hits the hardest. The person making you feel this way doesn't even look like a manipulator. They don't appear cruel. They don't seem calculated. In fact, sometimes they seem distant, confused, even emotionally unavailable rather than controlling. But what you're experiencing feels exactly like gaslighting. And that's where most people get stuck because they try to label it as intentional manipulation when in reality, it's something much deeper, something wired into the psychology of avoidance itself. Avoidants don't wake up thinking, how can I distort someone's reality today? That's not what's happening. What's actually happening is far more unsettling because it's automatic, it's subconscious, it's a defense mechanism, so deeply ingrained that even they believe the version of reality they present to you. And that's why it feels so convincing. That's why it makes you question yourself instead of questioning them. When you first connect with someone like this, everything can feel surprisingly normal, maybe even intense in a subtle way. There are moments of closeness, glimpses of emotional availability, small signals that make you feel seen. And just when you start to trust it, something changes. A shift you can't fully explain. The warmth cools down, the connection becomes inconsistent, and when you bring it up, hoping to understand what's happening, that's when the confusion really begins. Because instead of clarity, you get responses that make you feel like you imagined everything. You hear things like, you're reading too much into it, or it wasn't that serious, or you're overthinking again. And suddenly, the emotional experience that felt so real to you starts to feel invalid, almost embarrassing to even mention. You start shrinking your feelings just to avoid that uncomfortable dismissal. And without realizing it, you begin stepping out of your own reality and into theirs. This is what gaslighting feels like. Not always loud, not always aggressive, but deeply disorienting. It's that slow erosion of trust in your own perception, that feeling of walking away from conversations more confused than when you entered them. It's when your emotions get turned into something irrational, something exaggerated, something that needs to be fixed instead of understood. And here's the truth most people don't want to face. The reason it hurts so much is because it doesn't feel fake. It feels real. Their certainty makes it feel real. When someone denies something with enough calmness, enough emotional distance, enough conviction, your brain starts to assume they must be right. Because if they're so unaffected, so sure, so grounded, then maybe you're the one losing control. Maybe you're the one misinterpreting everything. But that's exactly how the cycle takes hold, not through force, but through subtle emotional contradiction. You feel something deeply, and they respond like it doesn't exist. You remember something clearly, and they act like it never mattered. And over time, those small moments stack up until your inner voice gets quieter and quieter. What makes this even more complicated is that avoidants don't experience emotions the same way in those moments. When things get too close, too intense, too vulnerable, something inside them shuts down. It's not a conscious decision, it's an automatic deactivation. Their system goes into protection mode. And when that happens, their memory of emotional events changes, not because they're trying to deceive you, but because their mind is literally filtering out the intensity to keep them safe. So when they say, that didn't mean anything, they might actually believe it. When they act like a deep moment wasn't that deep, it's because they've already disconnected from how it felt. And when you're standing there holding on to that moment, feeling its weight, its meaning, its impact, it creates a gap between your reality and theirs that feels impossible to bridge. You're remembering the connection, they're remembering the distance. And that gap, that emotional mismatch, is where the feeling of gaslighting lives. Because from your side, it feels like denial, it feels like distortion, it feels like your reality is being rewritten right in front of you. But from their side, it feels like they're just being honest about what they feel now, even if it contradicts everything they showed you before. This is why arguing with an avoidant rarely brings clarity, Because you're not just arguing about facts, you're arguing about two completely different emotional realities. You're trying to validate a moment they've already disconnected from. And the more you try to explain it, the more they pull back, the more they minimize, the more they simplify it into something that feels manageable for them. And every time that happens, you feel a little more lost. You start replaying everything, trying to make sense of where things went wrong. You analyze your words, your tone, your reactions, searching for the exact point where you might have pushed too hard, expected too much, felt too deeply. And without even realizing it, you begin turning against yourself. That's the hidden impact of this dynamic. It doesn't just confuse you about the relationship, it confuses you about yourself. Because when someone consistently downplays your emotional reality, you don't just question them, you start questioning your own emotional instincts. You start wondering if your needs are too much, if your expectations are unrealistic, if your feelings are exaggerated, and that's where the real damage begins. Because now, it's not just about what they're saying anymore, it's about what you've started believing about yourself. And the hardest part is, you didn't get here overnight. It happened slowly, through small dismissals, through subtle contradictions, through moments where what you felt didn't match what they acknowledged, until one day you realize you don't feel as certain about anything anymore. Not about what happened, not about what you felt, not even about what you deserve. And that's why understanding this dynamic matters so much. Because once you see it clearly, once you recognize that this isn't just random confusion, but a pattern rooted in emotional avoidance, something shifts. You stop chasing validation from someone who's disconnected from their own emotions. You stop trying to prove your reality to someone who can't fully access theirs in those moments. And most importantly, you start coming back to yourself. Because the truth is, your feelings weren't wrong. Your experience wasn't imagined. Your reality wasn't exaggerated. You were just trying to make sense of someone who disconnects from theirs the moment it becomes too real. And once you start coming back to yourself, something uncomfortable begins to surface, a realization that's hard to accept at first. It's not just that they made you question your reality, it's that they truly believe theirs. That's what makes this so deeply confusing. Because when someone is intentionally manipulating, there are cracks. There are moments where you can see the inconsistency, the strategy, the awareness behind it. But here, it feels different. It feels almost genuine. That's because in many cases it is. Avoidants don't sit there thinking they're rewriting the story. They're not consciously deciding to deny your experience just to control you. What they're doing feels like honesty to them. When they say something didn't matter, it's because in that exact moment it doesn't feel like it does. When they dismiss a deep emotional connection, it's because they've already shut down the part of themselves that felt it. And that's where things start to break inside you, because you're dealing with someone who can look you in the eyes and calmly invalidate something that meant everything to you without even flinching. No guilt, no hesitation, no sense that anything important is being erased. And your mind tries to make sense of it, it searches for logic, because if they're so calm about it, if they're so certain, then maybe they're right. Maybe you did misinterpret things. Maybe you did read too much into it. Maybe you created meaning where there wasn't any. But deep down, something in you resists that conclusion because you remember how it felt. You remember the tone in their voice, the way they showed up, the moments where they leaned in instead of pulling away, the things they said that weren't forced, weren't vague, weren't distant. They were real. You felt them in your chest, not just heard them in your mind. And now you're being told those moments didn't mean what you thought they did. So you're stuck between two realities, the one you experienced and the one they're presenting. And the longer you stay in that space, the more exhausting it becomes, because you're constantly trying to reconcile something that doesn't line up. This is where emotional shutdown starts playing a bigger role than most people realize. When avoidants feel overwhelmed by closeness, their system doesn't just create distance physically, it creates distance internally. It numbs out emotional intensity. It reduces the significance of moments that once felt meaningful. It's like their mind is turning down the volume on anything that could pull them into vulnerability. And when that happens, their perception changes. It's not that they're choosing to forget, it's that they're filtering. They keep the facts, but lose the feeling. So they might remember spending time with you, but not the depth of connection that came with it. They might recall a conversation, but not the emotional weight behind the words. They might acknowledge that something happened, but strip it of all the meaning that made it important to you. And when they communicate from that filtered version of reality, It feels like denial. It feels like you're being erased from your own story. Because for you, those moments weren't just events, they were experiences. They carried emotion, intention, connection. But for them, after that shutdown, those same moments become neutral, almost insignificant. And that's where the distortion begins to hurt the most. Because you're not just losing the connection, you're losing the shared understanding of what that connection was. You start asking questions that don't have clear answers. How could something that felt so real to me feel so small to them? How can they just switch like that? Was any of it real at all? And that last question, that's the one that lingers. Because when someone minimizes something that mattered deeply to you, it doesn't just make you question the moment, it makes you question the entire foundation of what you had. But here's the difficult truth. It was real, it just wasn't sustainable for them. And instead of holding on to that reality, their mind shifts into protection mode. It reduces the importance of what happened so they don't have to face the vulnerability that came with it. It convinces them that it wasn't that deep, that serious, that meaningful, because if it was, they would have to feel it, and feeling it would mean losing control. So they disconnect, and in that disconnection, your reality becomes something they can no longer fully access. This is why you'll hear things that feel almost surreal, statements that completely contradict their previous actions, a sudden emotional distance that doesn't match the closeness you shared. It's not just confusing, it's destabilizing because you're trying to hold on to something they've already let go of internally. And the more you try to bring it back into focus, the more they push it further away. At this point, something else begins to happen, something even more subtle, but just as damaging. They start minimizing your emotional reactions. Not aggressively, not harshly, but in a way that slowly chips away at your confidence in what you feel. You express hurt, and they call it overthinking. You seek clarity, and they frame it as pressure. You try to talk about what changed, and they label it as unnecessary drama. And little by little, your emotions start to feel like a problem that needs to be fixed instead of a signal that needs to be understood. You begin editing yourself before speaking, softening your words, holding back your thoughts, not because you don't feel them, but because you already know how they'll be received, dismissed, minimized, turned into something irrational. And when that happens enough times, you stop trusting your own emotional responses. You hesitate before expressing anything real. You question whether your feelings are valid before even allowing yourself to fully feel them. You start shrinking your emotional world just to keep the peace. But the peace you're creating comes at a cost. Because every time you silence yourself to avoid being invalidated, you move further away from who you are. And that's where the real damage settles in. It's not just about the confusion anymore. It's about the quiet loss of your emotional clarity, the slow fading of your inner voice, the growing distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. And all of this is happening while they remain calm, unaffected, certain, which only makes it harder to trust yourself. Because if they're so unbothered, so steady, so sure that nothing is wrong, then why does it feel so heavy inside you? Why does it feel like something is constantly off, even when they act like everything is fine? That's the contradiction that keeps you stuck. Their calmness doesn't reflect clarity, it reflects disconnection. But when you're in it, it's almost impossible to tell the difference. So you keep trying to adjust, trying to communicate better, trying to be more understanding, trying to find the right way to express what you feel so that maybe this time they'll finally see it. But no matter how clearly you explain it, it keeps coming back to the same place, your reality versus theirs. And the more you try to bridge that gap, the more it feels like you're the only one doing the work because they're not meeting you in that emotional space. They've already stepped out of it. Or when you finally notice that you're the only one trying to bridge that gap, something shifts inside you again. Not clarity, not yet, but a quiet exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from one big moment, but from hundreds of small ones. Moments where you tried to explain yourself. Moments where you softened your tone, chose your words carefully, replayed conversations in your head before even having them, just to avoid being dismissed again. Because at this point, it's not just about being misunderstood, it's about feeling like no matter how clearly you show up, it still gets turned into something else. You start realizing that every attempt to get closer somehow creates more distance. Every effort to bring truth into the conversation somehow gets flipped redirected, or quietly shut down. And eventually, you begin to hesitate before even trying. Not because you don't care anymore, but because you're tired of feeling like the only one who does. This is where the push-pull cycle becomes impossible to ignore. Because just when you start pulling back to protect yourself, something changes again. They come closer, not fully, not consistently, but just enough. A message that feels warm, a moment of attention that feels genuine, a version of them that reminds you of how it used to feel in the beginning, and suddenly everything softens. The confusion fades just for a moment. The doubt quiets down, and you find yourself thinking, maybe I was wrong, maybe they do care, maybe things are finally shifting, but what you're actually experiencing isn't stability, it's contrast. Because that warmth only feels so powerful after the cold distance that came before it. And without realizing it, you get pulled back into the cycle. You open up again, you lean in again, you allow yourself to feel again. And just as things begin to feel real, grounded, consistent, they pull away again. And when you try to make sense of it, when you try to understand why the shift happened, you're met with the same patterns. It's not that deep. You're overthinking it. You're making something out of nothing. And just like that, the connection you felt gets rewritten into something insignificant. This cycle doesn't just confuse you, it conditions you. Because now your emotional state becomes tied to their inconsistency. You start craving those moments of closeness, not because they're stable, but because they're rare. And the rarity makes them feel valuable. But what's actually happening is something much deeper. You're being trained to doubt the painful moments and hold on to the good ones. Even when the painful ones are the pattern and the good ones are the exception. And over time, this creates a kind of emotional disorientation that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Because from the outside, it might look like you're holding on to something that isn't there, but from the inside, it feels like you're holding on to something that keeps disappearing. And every time it disappears, you're left trying to figure out if it was ever real to begin with. This is where selective memory starts playing a quiet but powerful role. Because while you're holding on to the emotional timeline of what happened, they're holding on to a much more simplified version, one that doesn't carry the same depth, one that filters out the intensity and focuses only on what feels manageable. So when you bring up the pattern, the repeated pulling away, the inconsistency, they don't see it the way you do. To them, it's not a cycle. It's isolated moments, separate incidents that don't connect into a bigger picture. And because of that, every time you try to address the pattern, it gets reduced to a single moment. You're upset about that one thing. You're holding on to something small. You're making a big deal out of one situation. But what they don't acknowledge, what they can't fully access in that state, is that it's not one thing. It's everything. It's the accumulation of every time you felt something real and then watched it get minimized. Every time you trusted the connection and then felt it disappear. Every time you tried to bring clarity and left feeling more confused. But because they don't experience it as a continuous emotional thread, they can't validate it as one, and that leaves you in a position where you're trying to explain something that only makes sense when seen as a whole to someone who only sees fragments. That's why it feels like you're never fully heard, because you're speaking from a place of emotional continuity and they're responding from a place of emotional detachment, and the gap between those two experiences keeps widening. At some point, you begin to notice something else, something that feels subtle at first, but becomes more obvious over time. They rarely take accountability, not in the way you need them to. It's not that they never say sorry, sometimes they do, but even those apologies feel incomplete, surface level, like they're acknowledging the situation without fully stepping into the emotional impact of it. Because true accountability requires something they struggle with deeply, vulnerability. To fully take responsibility would mean sitting with the discomfort of how their actions affected you. It would mean staying present in a moment that feels emotionally intense. It would mean opening a door to feelings they've spent a long time learning how to avoid. So instead, they find ways around it. They justify, they explain, they reframe, they shift the focus slightly, just enough to avoid fully stepping into that emotional space. And sometimes, without you even realizing it, the conversation turns. What started as you expressing hurt slowly becomes about how your reaction was too much, too intense, too unnecessary. And now instead of them explaining their behavior, you're explaining your feelings, defending them, softening them, trying to make them more acceptable. And in that moment, the entire dynamic flips. You go from seeking understanding to seeking permission to feel what you feel. And that's where things start to feel deeply unfair because you're carrying the weight of both sides, trying to understand them while also trying to justify yourself, trying to stay patient while also feeling hurt, trying to keep the connection alive while also slowly losing yourself inside it. And the hardest part is, a part of you still hopes it will change because you've seen glimpses of something real, moments where they were present, moments where they let their guard down, moments where it felt like the connection was mutual, not one-sided, and those moments stay with you. They give you just enough evidence to believe that maybe underneath all of this, there's something worth holding on to. But what you're actually holding on to is potential. Not consistency, not stability, not emotional safety, just potential. And potential without consistency becomes one of the most painful things to let go of because it keeps you waiting for a version of someone that only shows up in fragments. And every time you think that version is finally here to stay, it disappears again. Every time it disappears, it takes a little piece of your certainty with it. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly. You start hesitating before you speak, questioning how you feel, wondering if you're too much. And before you realize it, it's not just about them anymore, it's about how this has changed you. You used to trust yourself, now you second guess everything. Not just what they did, but how you felt about it. You start asking if you're overreacting, if you're expecting too much, if your emotions are even valid. That's what this does. It's not just someone denying your reality, it's you slowly disconnecting from it. But here's the truth. You didn't become this way because you were weak. You became this way because you were trying to make sense of something that kept undoing you. You kept adjusting, hoping clarity would come. But the problem was never how you expressed yourself. It was that you were trying to be understood by someone who disconnects when things get real. And once you see that pattern clearly, everything shifts. You stop trying to prove your reality. You stop waiting for them to validate what you already felt. And slowly, you come back to yourself. You start trusting your feelings again. You stop ignoring your discomfort. You begin to see that your emotions were never the problem. They were signals. And that's when clarity hits. It doesn't matter if it was intentional or not. The impact was real. The confusion, the doubt, the exhaustion, all real. And your healing doesn't depend on their intentions. It depends on your awareness. Because once you truly see the pattern, you stop asking, do they care? And start asking, is this healthy for me? And that changes everything. Because in the end, you were never too sensitive. You were just responding to something that kept making you lose yourself. And the moment you see that clearly, you don't just understand the pattern, you outgrow it.